Hello, my name is Laura Judge, and I am a graduate student in the agroecology program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I want to tell you today about some research that I've done on the topic of grazing cattle and using them as a grassland management tool. And this video is created specifically for folks in Wisconsin that manage grasslands for conservation benefit. I'll start with a brief introduction and then talk about some common grassland management goals and then cover research results and management implications. So first I want to take a look at the amount of grasslands in Wisconsin currently. This map is showing many types of land cover, and the shades of green are forest and red is depicting row crop agriculture. Working grasslands, that's our pastures and hay fields, are in pink, and those comprise 15% of Wisconsin's total land area. Conservation grasslands are yellow and make up less than 1% of Wisconsin's land area. And I like to define these two types of grasslands by their management goals. So very broadly, working grasslands are areas where agricultural production goals are the primary concern and conservation goals are secondary. And conservation grasslands are defined as areas where conservation goals are first and foremost and agricultural production goals are secondary. And I want to quickly note that these are not mutually exclusive, especially in terms of their outcomes. For example, we can have great conservation outcomes on well-managed working grasslands or good agricultural production outcomes on well-managed conservation grasslands. The difference is simply in the primary goals of management. And since we have such a small amount of conservation grasslands on the landscape, that less than 1% of the landscape, their management for conservation goals rather than agricultural production goals is especially important. For the rest of this presentation, when I say grasslands, I'm referring to conservation grasslands. So what are some common grassland management goals? Well, because we're in the temperate and moist Midwest, perhaps the first goal that comes to your mind is preventing your grassland from looking like the picture here. In other words, keeping grass in grass. Another goal might be to foster native plants and native plant diversity, knowing that doing so can help pollinating insects and other wildlife. And another goal might be to increase habitat for wildlife, especially grassland bird species which are in steep decline. Alright, before we dive into the research, I want to cover a little bit of grazing terminology. So first we have stocking rate, and that refers to season-long animal impact. So assuming both of the pastures pictured here are grazed for the same amount of time, say 3 months, the one on the left has a relatively low stocking rate and the one on the right has a relatively high stocking rate. Additionally, both of these pastures depict continuous grazing, where the whole pasture is grazed throughout the entire season. Now, pastures can also be subdivided into smaller areas called paddocks, and animals are moved between the paddocks, and this is called rotational grazing. So if we take the pasture on the left and we divide it into 4 paddocks, our stocking rate is the same, but we have now increased our stocking density, which is just simply the number of cattle or pounds of livestock present per unit area at any given moment in time. Or if we divide it into 8 paddocks, our stocking density has increased even further. Now, those are just a couple of key variables. And overall, grazing management is best represented as a spectrum of many potential variables. So I've created this slide as a general guide, but be aware that others may define these variables differently. But generally, we can think of low intensity grazing on the left, for example, as having no herd movement or paddock subdivisions, so continuous grazing, and or having a low stocking rate, and or having tall residual vegetation after livestock are removed, and or having low time input by the livestock manager. And here are some characteristics of moderate and high intensity grazing. Additionally, there are variables that can be optimized at any point in the spectrum, and that's livestock type, stocking density, and season or timing of grazing events. And the further toward the right on the spectrum that we are, and the more we try to optimize these additional variables, the more time, effort, and resources that are required for management. So due to resource limitations, the research I'm presenting today fell about here on the spectrum. And we did not optimize the additional variables at the bottom. For example, we were using cattle because they're readily available in Wisconsin, whereas sheep and goats, which are known to consume woody vegetation and might be preferred for that reason, are not readily available. And this research was performed on 3 conservation grasslands distributed across Wisconsin, and these are my code names for these sites. And I'm going to quickly flip through 3 slides that give characterization of different aspects of these sites, and please feel free to pause if you would like to study these more carefully. Hook Lake site, Western Prairie, and Buena Vista. There were 4 treatments at each site, so an exclusion that was not treated and not grazed. There were some graze-only plots that were only rotationally grazed. There were some plots that were initially mowed and then grazed rotationally every season thereafter, and some plots where woody plants were sprayed with foliar herbicide and then grazed rotationally every season thereafter. And this design focused on woody plant reduction and not so much on the prevention of woody plant growth. And we know that cattle typically don't browse woody vegetation, so that was the purpose of the mow and spray treatments, was to force the plants to send up new shoots at ground level in the hopes that the cattle would eat the regrowth or trample it. Additionally, this design was applied at 2 initial levels of woody cover. So what were the results of this research? We wanted to find out whether any of the treatments reduced woody plants, and we measured these changes over 2 to 3 seasons of rotational grazing. So I'm going to show some tables for each site, and I'll explain the first tables in detail and then go quickly through the others so that I can get to the key takeaways, but please just pause this video if you want to look more closely at the data. So first, here's the data for Hook Lake. The top table is showing low initial woody cover areas and the bottom table is showing high initial woody cover areas. The top row of each table is showing the total woody cover as a percentage, so that's representing all woody species. And all other values, those bottom 3 rows, are showing stem density, and that's in number of stems per 100 meters squared. The stems are also separated by size, so small stems are less than 2 centimeters in diameter, and large stems are greater than or equal to 2 centimeters in diameter. And where there's no size indicated, like with the gray dogwoods here, that just means all stems were less than 2 centimeters, so they're all small stems. The green color is coding for a decrease compared to control, and remember here that control just means that no treatments were applied, so no grazing, mowing, or herbicide. And we can see overall that there are limited reductions because no color coding means that there's no difference compared to control, and that the response varies even within the same species, for example, large versus small honeysuckle. These tables for Western Prairie are set up the same as the previous slide. We just have a new color here, and that's red, showing an increase compared to control. And lastly, our data for Buena Vista. And we can see in the bottom table here that we have our only reductions of any site due to grazing alone, and that's with the quaking aspens here. And these reductions were due to both browsing by cattle, so cattle eating the leaves, and also due to physical damage. So the picture on the right is showing where cattle have pushed over this aspen tree. So what do these results show us overall? First, that herbicide and grazing was the most reliable reduction technique across all sites and species, and that we did see some physical impact and browsing, but that it was only linked to reductions in quaking aspens, just one species. And the results are very species and size specific. We also think that stocking density is likely important because though all sites had low stocking densities, Buena Vista did have the highest of any site. And lastly, based on these highly variable results, monitoring is recommended if reducing woody plants is a key concern. We also wanted to find out whether rotational grazing resulted in plant community improvements at our sites. I'll quickly note that all sites were dominated by cool season grasses, and that the most common forb at every site was goldenrod species, mostly Canada goldenrod. So increasing plant diversity might look like reducing the dominant cool season grasses or Canada goldenrod to allow for establishment of new species, especially new native plant species. So again, I'm going to quickly show the data, and this data is measured in absolute cover of each species or group. So different letters here are depicting statistically significant differences. So we saw, based on these graphs, that non-native cool season grasses were higher in grazed areas at every site, and that could be either an increase in the Kentucky bluegrass and the top graph, or increases in other cool season grass species in the bottom graph. Conversely, we saw that goldenrod species were lower in grazed areas at 2 out of 3 sites, and that they trended lower in grazed areas at the third. So here's a quick visual on those reductions. We have a grazing exclusion on the left and a grazed plot on the right. So we wondered, did these reductions result in increases in other native forbs, which might ultimately lead to an increase in native plant diversity? So here's the data answering that question. The green here is coding for an increase in cover compared to control. So we can see that there was an increase in native forbs at one site with grazing, and that was where cover was already relatively high, at 25% cover in control areas at that site. So overall, these results suggest that grazing increases non-native cool season grasses, but it decreases the dominant goldenrods, and we think this effect is primarily due to trampling by cattle, as they don't typically eat goldenrods. The results also suggest that grazing may increase native forbs, but only where they're initially prevalent. Additionally, non-native forbs and native plant diversity did not differ between grazed and ungrazed areas. And lastly, we wanted to find out whether grassland bird nesting habitat might be improved by rotational grazing. And these species were selected for study because they are in steep decline, and we know that how we manage grasslands directly impacts them, because they're nesting on the ground from April 25th till August 1st. And we also know that cattle can create disturbances by removing vegetative cover or simply trampling nests during the nesting season. So typically, when using conservation grazing, nesting refuges, which are ungrazed from April 25th to August 1st, are used. So I collected data on some in-field characteristics of simulated spring nesting refuge habitat. So I collected data at 2 sites on litter cover, litter depth, and vegetation height density, which are some key habitat characteristics for grassland birds. And different letters are depicting statistical differences, so that we can see here that litter depth was significantly lower in grazed areas at both sites. So overall, 2 to 3 seasons of grazing had a limited effect on the spring nesting habitat because it only differed by litter depth. But different bird species have different requirements, so these impacts will vary depending on the species. But generally, by comparing our data to the known habitat preferences of different species, suggests that there's essentially no benefit from grazing to spring nesting habitat. However, these species are complex, and many prefer different habitat characteristics during different life stages. For example, the greater prairie chicken is known to use recently grazed areas as brood rearing habitat, so it's hard to make generalizations on any benefits or drawbacks of grazing to bird habitat. So overall from this research, did we see that grazing resulted in progress toward conservation goals? Well, there was limited evidence for that, but I'll quickly note that there may be other motivations for grazing on conservation grasslands. Those might include building relationships with local farmers or allowing farmers to rest their home pastures, which could result in more wildlife habitat on private land on those working grasslands. But we saw that grazing alone is not a silver bullet solution for meeting conservation goals in conservation grasslands, and that it should be used in combination with other management tools, and that a more management intensive approach might help, and that further experimentation is needed. And lastly, we want to highlight adaptive management, which many of you are probably already familiar with, and that's where monitoring is performed and future decisions are based on the results of monitoring. And this may be key if using conservation grazing, especially because conservation grasslands are often dominated by non-native plants, making them a relatively novel ecosystem, and best practices may be unknown or even be a moving target in these areas. So please feel free to reach out to me with questions or for more information or the full write-up of this research. I also have a one-page quick tips guide for grassland bird-friendly grazing that goes beyond the idea of the nesting refuge that I am happy to send to you. So please reach out to me. Thanks for listening today, and I look forward to hearing from you.